Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. I'm Bogus Meat Factory. Let's talk about games. Now, for those who have been a regular viewer of my channel, typically you've seen that we have reserved that space for stream archives. I'm a person who streams video games 4 days a week on Twitch at twitch.tv/bogusmeatfactory, but I moved those to a different channel because I wanted to actually reserve this space for something a little bit more interesting, where I would be spending time editorializing video game discussion, things that make video games interesting, reminiscing about the past and games that I have loved since my childhood, as well as talking about current events, news, and things that are a little more up-to-date and interesting. Now, before we begin, I think one of the things that I really want to talk about, I think that's really important for people, is that we set up expectations. Typically, whenever you read an article or read a review, it's very important to get a better understanding of the person who is writing it and getting a look into their own perspective, what it is that they value. And for me in particular, I think that it's very important for you to understand my personal values for what I enjoy about video games. The first one that I want to talk about is novelty. Now, I've been playing games now for over 35 years, so I've played a lot of games. So for me now, I need something a little different. I need something unique and fascinating. I need games that I can play in different ways, that are unorthodox and unusual. And that's not to say or to devalue folks that don't value novelty. I think that it's perfectly fine for a person to enjoy one or two types of games and stick strictly to those genres. There's nothing wrong with that. Everybody has a different perspective. But for me, novelty is important. Ever since I'd gotten the Wii and played games with that motion controls, and I know a lot of people are going to sit there and go, motion controls bad. I disagree. It's a different way to play. And I think it's a great evolution of how we play games. And we'll definitely be at some point talking about why the Wii is such a landmark piece of hardware for video games in the future. But for me, the novelty of how we played those games really gripped me in interesting and fascinating ways. Not only that, systems like the Dreamcast and their use of the VMU in a lot of different off-screen play and ways to connect with other people was a very novel and interesting, piece of hardware. Also, the Wii U had a really great asynchronous gameplay mechanic that I very much enjoyed. These sorts of things make gaming very much more diverse and interesting. It means that something can be novel, different, right? And that's important for me because, again, I don't want to play the same style of game that I've experienced for so many years. And there's nothing wrong with sometimes going back to the tried and true formulas that we have grown accustomed to, but it's just something that I enjoy. The next thing that I want to talk about is immersion. Now, a lot of people are going to assume that immersion just simply means a game within which you can roleplay, get into character, these sorts of things. But in reality, immersion means, for me, the ability to forget that you are playing a game. It is that moment that can be where I am in character, I'm immersed in the world, in the story, in the characters, but it can also mean that I am lost in the gameplay. That moment where you look at the clock and say, I've been playing this game for 3 hours. I had no idea. Oh my God, it's 2 a.m. Those can be games that we know and love, like the Civilization franchise for me, The Sims, but also games like Morrowind and the original classic EverQuest. Immersion can be attention to detail, like in the Shenmue series. Immersion can be just a great story that you connect to as a player. Immersion is anything that allows you to suck you into the world or lose track of time. It's what sucks you in. And I think that that's incredibly valuable in modern games and games of old as well. What's interesting is that we also, to tie this into the next point, is player agency, right? Player agency is incredibly important to me as well. That ability for a player to express themselves in unique ways that are catered to their own play styles. That's not saying offering a bunch of different gameplay mechanics, although it can, like in the case of something like Minecraft, right? Where a player can dedicate themselves to building, dedicate themselves to exploring, dedicate themselves to combat, and these sorts of things, right? They don't have to stick to one particular way to play a game. That's a form of player agency. But in other instances, it's allowing me to customize characters in my own way and engage in the software in a way that is distinctly my own. One of the great examples of this is, again, in the classic MMORPG EverQuest. It used a text parser to interact with NPCs. So instead of clicking dialogue boxes and, pre-canned reactions to, the written word in games like World of Warcraft or in other games like Mass Effect, you had to type out your questions and your responses to NPCs utilizing keywords that they would hint at in the dialogue, but you got to type out in text chat the full sentence the way that you feel was important to your character. And that was offering agency. And that also fed into immersion. That ability to let you express yourself in a game in a very nuanced way is incredibly, incredibly valuable. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is a little harder to pin down. This is one of those things that, like with all of these things, it's very subjective, of course, but one of these things that is difficult to describe, and that is intimacy. Now, what I mean by intimacy is a situation where you're open to emotions, where you become, you connect. That doesn't necessarily mean with a single player experience. Far from it. In reality, one of the greatest examples of intimacy for me is when playing multiplayer games. It's those moments where you are facing off with an opponent one-on-one in a fighting game, like in the Virtual Fighter series or the Street Fighter series, right? Where you are having to read those players. You're engaged in intimate combat. Other instances are working together with other people, multiplayer games, like Sea of Thieves or Minecraft, where you're working together or against each other, but in a world where those other people matter. They're valuable because they offer an experience that can be either positive or negative to you, and you become invested because of that. That's not limited strictly to multiplayer games, because intimacy also means a connection to story. It means connection to software. I've harped on this point a million times when going on stream, where we talk about connections with software, with other people, these sorts of things. How do we connect with software? It's a combination of a lot of things. But in reality, what it means is an openness emotionally to let a game take you for a ride, a journey. That's not something that a lot of people are willing to do, and that's perfectly fine. For a lot of folks, they don't want to get a lot of stuff out of it. They just want entertainment. And again, completely valid and valuable. But for me personally, I very much play games and open myself up to those experiences. I let the game tell me a story. I let a game move me to emotions. I let a game take me for that ride and allow me to interact with it. It's a back and forth. It's like communication when you're talking with another person, right? You're listening, you're speaking, you're sitting there computing all of the information and replying. I like to look at a game like a old school 1980s text adventure games as being one of the most intimate experiences. It's a moment where you're typing a command to a computer. The computer takes that command. They listen to you. They try to understand what it is you're trying to say, and it formulates a response. And you're having a conversation. You are talking and telling a story where the computer is the game master and you're the player. And that relationship is intimate. It's interesting. But those are the sorts of things that I think are really important for you to understand, that when we talk about games, those are the sorts of things that I find interesting. Those are the sorts of things that, when are present, mean a lot more to me. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything's set in stone, that it has to meet these requirements for me to say it's a good game or one that I enjoy. Far from it. But when those things are present, that becomes a more powerful game, right? And you can achieve those sorts of things in a lot of different ways. For everybody, it's different. And it's also incredibly important to understand that there are other people that value things differently. And they will judge games based on those values. So when you see a situation where a person criticizes a game, it's because they value something very differently than you. And there's that conflict of values. But that does not mean that they are necessarily wrong, unless they're making lots of base assumptions on objectivity. We'll get into that topic at some point. But the world of games is subjective. It's viewed through the lens of the person and individual, right? So please understand that. Now, when we talk about games in general, really take into consideration those 4 very particular facets that I value, and you'll be able to see where I'm coming from, especially when we talk about games in general. Now, I'd like to hear from you guys about what is it that you value about games. It can be something as simple as gameplay, game feel, story, that sort of thing, and that's totally fine. You're not going to be stuck in a situation where I'm going to sit here and argue with you about those things. But I want to hear from you about the stuff that you love. So tell me what you value in games and give examples of them. If you do so, they may be featured in future episodes. I'd love to highlight those things. And if not, no one comments, no big deal. So I am Bogus Meat Factory. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time. To humor.